Picture this. It's a summer morning in London, 1665. You wake up and reach out to shake your neighbor awake, and he doesn't move. You look closer. There are lumps under his skin. Dark, swollen lumps the size of eggs clustered under his arms and along his neck. His face is gray. His lips are cracked and black. By nightfall, a cart rolls through your street. A man in a long black coat with a beak mask stuffed with herbs knocks on doors. You hear the words no one in London wanted to hear. Bring out your dead. By nightfall, a cart rolls through your street. A man in a long black coat with a beak mask stuffed with herbs knocks on doors. You hear the words no one in London wanted to hear. Bring out your dead. In the year 1665, one of the most terrifying disasters in all of human history didn't happen in a war zone. It didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened on the cobblestone streets of the most powerful city in the Western world, London, England. And what unfolded over the next 18 months was so horrifying, so raw, and so deeply human that most history books barely scratch the surface. Today, we're going to change that. We're going all the way in. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll see London in 1665 the way the people who actually lived it did. And trust me, it will leave a mark. To understand what London went through in 1665, you have to understand what London was in 1665. This was a city of roughly 460,000 people, massive by the standards of the time. It was loud, it was crowded, and it was absolutely filthy. Imagine a city with no running water, no sewage system in the modern sense, and streets where animal waste, human waste, and rotting food all mixed together in the gutters. Rats were everywhere. Not a few rats, millions of rats. They ran through market stalls, through the basements of homes, through the alleyways that snaked between tightly packed wooden buildings. Now here's something most people don't realize. When we talk about the Great Plague of 1665, we're not talking about the first plague, not even close. London had seen waves of plague going all the way back to the Black Death in 1347, which had wiped out somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of all of Europe. Each generation that survived thought they were in the clear. They were wrong. By the mid-1600s, plague had become something Londoners almost normalized, a terrible seasonal threat like a storm that came back every few decades and took the unlucky ones. But in the spring of 1665, something was different. Something had shifted, and the people of London were about to find out just how unprepared they truly were. And what happens next is where things get truly unbelievable. The first confirmed cases of the 1665 outbreak appeared in the parish of St. Giles in the Fields, a poor, overcrowded neighborhood in the western part of the city. It was December 1664 when the first deaths were quietly recorded. Quietly because no one wanted to panic the city. No one wanted to believe it was starting again. By the spring of 1665, denial was no longer possible. The disease spreading through London was Yersinia pestis, the same bacterial strain responsible for the Black Death 3 centuries earlier. It traveled primarily through fleas carried by rats, and in a city as densely packed and rat-infested as London, it moved like fire through dry wood. You could be perfectly healthy in the morning and dead by midnight. The symptoms were unmistakable. Within days of exposure, victims developed what were called buboes, swollen, pus-filled lymph nodes that appeared in the groin, armpit, or neck. The pain was described as so intense that people would throw themselves into rivers just to get relief from the pressure. Then came the fever, the vomiting, the delirium, and in most cases, death. The mortality rate for untreated bubonic plague ran as high as 60 to 70%. Without modern antibiotics, survival was largely a matter of luck and constitution. But here's the detail that most people have never heard, and it tells you everything about what life was actually like in those months. When the city authorities confirmed the plague was spreading, they instituted a practice called shutting up houses. Any home where a plague case was confirmed, even a suspected case, was physically locked from the outside. The entire family was sealed inside. A red cross was painted on the door. A watchman was posted to make sure no one left. Not the sick, not the healthy, not the children. Everyone. You could be perfectly healthy, living in a house with a sick relative, and you would be locked inside with them for 40 days, with no way out and no real medical help coming in. Neighbors would lower food baskets from upstairs windows. People begged from behind their sealed doors. Some families broke out in the night and ran. Some watchmen were bribed to look the other way. And some families, entire families, simply never came out at all. Pause for a second. Did you already know about the shutting up practice? Because most people have absolutely no idea that healthy Londoners were being locked inside plague houses with the dying. Let me know in the comments, did this surprise you? But the shutting up of houses was only the beginning of the horror that was sweeping through London's streets. As summer arrived, so did the peak of the epidemic. The bills of mortality, London's weekly death records, started telling a story that made even the most hardened city officials go pale. In the week ending September 12, 1665, 7,165 people died from plague in a single week. Let that land for a moment. 1 week, 1 city, over 7,000 people. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the equivalent of a medium-sized American town being wiped out in 7 days. The city was transforming in real time. Businesses closed, shops shuttered. Streets that had once been among the most crowded in all of Europe fell silent. The wealthy fled, and that is a crucial point because it tells you something deeply uncomfortable about who gets to survive disasters. King Charles II and his entire court packed up and left London for Oxford. Wealthy merchants sent their families to the countryside. Anyone with money, property, or connections got out. And those who couldn't, the poor, the servants, the tradespeople, they stayed. They always stay, because they had nowhere to go. One of the most vivid accounts of this period comes from Samuel Pepys, a naval administrator who kept a detailed diary through the entire plague year. He watched London fall apart from his window. He described seeing the streets empty for the first time in his life. He wrote about stepping over dead bodies on his way to work. He noted how the cries of "Lord, have mercy on us" echoed from houses marked with the Red Cross. And yet, here's the part that feels almost impossible to comprehend. He kept going to work. He attended dinners. He carried on. Because what else do you do when catastrophe becomes the new normal? Now, and this is where it gets really interesting, in the weeks following the peak of the outbreak, millions of people across the English-speaking world started digging into this exact moment in history, and it's easy to understand why. In fact, this story resonated so deeply in recent years that searches for plague history and epidemic survival surged dramatically, because people living through modern health crises suddenly saw a 350-year-old mirror being held up to their own world. The parallels are undeniable. The wealthy flee, the poor stay, the healthy get locked in with the sick, the authorities fumble, the people adapt. History isn't old, it's just waiting to be recognized.
Quick question, and I want a real answer in the comments. If you had been living in London in 1665, what would you have done? Option A, you stay and try to help your community. Option B, you get out the moment rumors of plague start spreading. Team A or Team B? Go. Stay with me, because what I'm about to share in the next part is something that almost never gets talked about.
Let's talk about the plague doctors, because this is one of those images from history that everyone recognizes. The long black cloak, the wide-brimmed hat, the terrifying beak mask. But almost nobody knows what those men actually did or didn't do. The beak mask was stuffed with herbs and sweet-smelling flowers. The theory, based on the dominant medical belief of the era, was that plague spread through bad air, miasma. If you could filter the foul air through aromatic plants, you might protect yourself. It was completely wrong, but it wasn't stupidity. It was the best science these men had, and some of them walked directly into plague houses carrying it, knowing the risk. The treatments they offered were, by our standards, almost entirely useless and often actively harmful. Bleeding, herbal purges, applying dead pigeons to the buboes, burning sulfur in rooms. Some physicians prescribed tobacco, which meant that for a brief, strange window in English history, doctors ordered their patients to smoke. But here's the humanity in it. Some of these plague doctors weren't even formally trained physicians. They were men who stepped up because no one else would. Because the real doctors, the ones with prestigious practices and wealthy patients, had already left with everyone else. The people left behind in London were often served by whoever was brave enough or desperate enough to stay. And then there are the stories of the ordinary people that history almost forgot entirely. There was a village just north of London called Eyam, a small, self-contained community in Derbyshire that, according to legend, made a decision so staggering it sounds impossible. When plague arrived via a parcel of infected cloth from London, the village rector and community leaders convinced the entire village to voluntarily quarantine themselves. They sealed themselves off from the world. They stayed in their village, knowing the plague was among them, to protect the surrounding towns and countryside from further spread. Pause. Of the 800 people living in Eyam when the plague arrived, around 260 died. But the surrounding region, which should have been devastated, was largely spared. The village of Eyam made a collective decision to absorb their own destruction to protect strangers they would never meet. That is not just history. That is one of the most astonishing acts of community sacrifice ever recorded on English soil. Back in London, as winter approached, the plague began to slow. Historians still debate exactly why. Possibly the weather, possibly the Great Fire of London in 1666, which destroyed much of the rat-infested slums and old wooden buildings that had harbored the fleas. Possibly some degree of acquired immunity among survivors. Possibly all of the above. But the city that emerged from 1665 was not the same city that had entered it. An estimated 68,000 to 100,000 people were dead, roughly a quarter of London's entire population. The grief was embedded in the city's bones. And yet London rebuilt. It always does.
So, what does all of this actually tell us? First, crises expose inequality with brutal precision. In 1665 London, your survival odds were directly tied to your wealth. The rich fled, the poor stayed.
The poor died in disproportionate numbers. That pattern did not begin in 1665, and it did not end there. Second, what this tells us is that human beings are extraordinarily adaptive under impossible conditions. Samuel Pepys went to work. Plague doctors wore their beak masks and walked into infected homes. Ordinary Londoners lowered food baskets from windows and whispered prayers through locked doors. Life insisted on continuing, even when death was everywhere. Third, the real lesson from Eyam is that collective sacrifice is possible. It is not naive or sentimental to believe that communities can choose to absorb suffering to protect others. The people of Eyam proved it at an almost incomprehensible cost. Fourth, the official responses, shutting up houses, burning plague goods, mass burial pits, were imperfect, often cruel, and frequently counterproductive. But they also reflected something we recognize: the desperate human instinct to draw a line, to contain, to try to impose order on chaos. And finally, the Great Plague of London was not just a medical event, it was a social earthquake. It shook the foundations of how London thought about poverty, about government responsibility, about the value of a human life. The city that came out the other side was different. Scarred, yes, but it had learned something, at tremendous cost, about what it truly means to live alongside each other.
If this story gave you something, even just one new way of seeing the world, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who deserve to hear stories like this. Now, I want to hear from you. If you had been one of the healthy people locked inside a plague house in 1665, what do you think would have broken you first? The fear, the isolation, or watching the people you love get sick around you? Drop your honest answer in the comments below. I personally read every single one. And if you're new here, welcome. Hit that red subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss what we drop next. We cover the stories history books left out, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. This is Legends Historian, where forgotten stories find their voice. Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp, and never stop asking why.